He stood up from his chair. The microphone fell. And nobody in that theater understood what was happening. Simon Cowell, the man who had seen thousands of performances, who had judged legends and dismissed amateurs with a single word, was walking away from the judges' table in the middle of a live show. His face was unreadable. His hands were shaking. The audience fell silent, cameras froze on his face, and backstage, producers were scrambling to understand what had just broken the most unshakable man on television. But to understand that moment, you have to go back 3 minutes earlier when a 68-year-old man named Daniel Crawford walked onto the America's Got Talent stage carrying nothing but a worn leather jacket and a letter he would never get to deliver. Subscribe now, because what happens next will redefine everything you thought you knew about Simon Cowell. Daniel Crawford was not supposed to be there. At 68 years old, with hands that trembled from early Parkinson's and a voice that hadn't been heard in public for 30 years, he had no business standing under those lights. But he had made a promise. And promises, he believed, were the only things that mattered when everything else was gone. His daughter, Emily, had died 6 months earlier. Terminal cancer. 29 years old. A singer who never got her shot, a dreamer who ran out of time. On her last night, she made him promise something that seemed impossible. "Dad, you have to sing for me. On a big stage. So the world knows I was here." Daniel hadn't sung since Emily was a child. He wasn't a performer. He was a mechanic from Ohio who spent his life fixing engines, not chasing dreams. But when your daughter asks you for one last thing, you don't say no. Even if it terrifies you. Even if it means standing in front of Simon Cowell. The stage was massive. The lights were blinding. Daniel stood there, clutching Emily's jacket, the one she wore to every open mic night she ever performed at. He had sewn a small pocket inside where he kept the letter she wrote him, the one that said, "Don't be afraid, Dad. I'll be with you." Simon leaned forward, arms crossed, expression neutral. He had seen this before: nervous contestants, emotional backstories, performances that would either soar or crash. He was ready to judge, to analyze, to decide. That was his job. That's what he did. "What are you going to perform today?" Simon asked, his voice sharp but not unkind. Daniel's voice cracked when he answered. "A song my daughter loved. She wanted me to sing it here. She's not here anymore, but I am." Simon nodded slowly. No sarcasm. No interruption. Just a nod. "All right. Let's hear it." The music started. A piano. Slow. Aching. The kind of melody that doesn't need words to break your heart. Daniel closed his eyes, gripped the microphone stand with both hands, and began to sing. His voice was not perfect. It wavered. It cracked in places. But it was real. Every note carried 30 years of silence, 6 months of grief, and a lifetime of love for a daughter who would never hear him sing again. The lyrics spoke of loss, of memory, of holding on when letting go felt impossible. And Simon Cowell, the man who never flinched, started to break. What Simon did next stopped the entire show. Producers begged him to sit back down, but he refused. Because sometimes there are moments bigger than television. Simon's hand moved to his face. He covered his mouth, then his eyes. His shoulders tensed. He wasn't crying, not yet, but he was fighting it. Hard. The other judges noticed. Heidi looked at him, concerned. Howie leaned over, whispering something. But Simon didn't respond. He was somewhere else. Somewhere the cameras couldn't reach. Daniel kept singing. His voice grew stronger, not technically, but emotionally. He wasn't performing anymore. He was delivering a message. To his daughter. To himself. To everyone who had ever lost someone and didn't know how to say goodbye. The audience was silent. Not the polite kind of silence. The heavy kind. The kind where breathing feels too loud. Phones were down. Eyes were locked on the stage. Some people were crying. Others were holding their breath. Everyone felt it. And then Simon stood up. It wasn't planned. There was no cue. No script. He just stood. His chair scraped against the floor. His microphone clattered onto the desk. The other judges turned to look at him, confused. The cameras swung toward him, trying to capture what was happening. But Simon wasn't looking at the cameras. He was looking at Daniel. Daniel opened his eyes and saw him. Standing there. Not judging. Not analyzing. Just standing. Present. Human. Simon took a step forward. Then another. He walked around the judges' table, past the golden buzzer, past the producers frantically signaling him to stop. He walked straight toward the stage. The audience gasped. No one had ever seen this before. Simon Cowell didn't walk onto the stage during a performance. He didn't break protocol. He didn't do this. But he was doing it now. Daniel's voice faltered for a second. He didn't know what was happening. Simon raised a hand, a gentle gesture that said, "Keep going. Don't stop." And Daniel did. He kept singing, his voice shaking now, tears streaming down his face, the leather jacket clutched against his chest like armor. Simon stopped at the edge of the stage. He didn't interrupt. He didn't speak. He just stood there, listening. Fully present. Fully human. The coldest man in television had melted, and everyone was watching it happen in real time. The song ended. Daniel's last note hung in the air, fragile and raw. The theater was silent. No one clapped. No one moved. It was too sacred to break. Simon climbed the steps onto the stage. Slowly. Deliberately. He walked toward Daniel, who stood frozen, unsure of what was about to happen. And then Simon did something no one expected. He reached out and took the leather jacket from Daniel's hands. "May I?" Simon asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the microphone. Daniel nodded, unable to speak. Simon held the jacket carefully, like it was made of glass. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at Daniel. "What was her name?" "Emily," Daniel whispered. Simon nodded. "Emily deserved to be heard. And because of you, she was. Leave a comment right now and tell us, have you ever made a promise you thought you couldn't keep? Because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming." Simon handed the jacket back to Daniel, but he didn't let go right away. He held it with him for just a moment, a gesture that said, "You're not alone in this." Then he stepped back, looked at the judges, and said something that shocked everyone in the building. "I'm not judging this." The other judges stared at him. Heidi's mouth opened in surprise. Howie frowned, confused. Sophia looked like she might cry. The audience murmured, uncertain. Simon continued, his voice steady now, louder. "This isn't a performance. This is a father keeping a promise to his daughter. You don't judge that. You honor it." He turned to Daniel. "You don't need my approval. You don't need a golden buzzer. You've already won something bigger than this show could ever give you." Daniel broke. Completely. He collapsed into Simon, and Simon caught him. Right there, on stage, in front of 3,000 people and millions watching at home, Simon Cowell held a sobbing stranger and let him fall apart. The audience erupted. Not with applause. With something deeper. A standing ovation born from empathy, from recognition, from the shared understanding that some things transcend entertainment. This was one of those things. Backstage, producers didn't know what to do. The show had stopped. There was no voting. No elimination. Just two men on a stage, one holding the other up while the world watched. When Daniel finally pulled away, Simon didn't let him go far. He kept a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "You honored her," Simon said, quiet enough that only Daniel could hear, but the microphones caught it anyway. "She knows. I promise you she knows." Daniel nodded, clutching the jacket again, and whispered, "Thank you." Simon walked him off the stage himself. Not the stage hands. Not the hosts. Simon Cowell, the man who never broke character, escorted a grieving father into the wings, past cameras, past crew members who stood in stunned silence, and stayed with him until Daniel's family came to take him home. When Simon returned to the judges' table 20 minutes later, he didn't say a word. He sat down, adjusted his microphone, and nodded to the host. "Let's continue." But something had changed. Everyone in that room felt it. The coldest judge on television had shown the world that beneath the sarcasm, beneath the brutal honesty, beneath the empire of fame and success, there was a man who understood that some things mattered more than winning. Share this video right now, because what Simon Cowell did next changed not just this show, but how we see vulnerability, strength, and what it really means to be human. The episode aired 3 weeks later. Producers debated cutting Simon's walk to the stage, worried it broke the show's format. But when they reviewed the footage, they realized something. It wasn't just television anymore. It was a moment. The kind that people remember long after the season ends. The response was overwhelming. Social media exploded. Not with jokes or memes, but with stories. People shared their own losses, their own promises, their own Daniel Crawfords. The video went viral not because it was shocking, but because it was real. Simon didn't comment publicly for a week. When he finally did, it was in a short statement. "I've judged a lot of performances. But some things aren't meant to be judged. They're meant to be witnessed." Behind the scenes, Simon called Daniel. Not for the cameras. Not for publicity. Just to check in. To make sure he was okay. To remind him that what he did mattered. That Emily's name had been spoken. That the promise had been kept. Daniel told him something that Simon would never forget. "You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to walk up there. But you did. And in that moment, I wasn't alone. Thank you for not letting me be alone." Simon didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. "Neither was I." That moment on stage wasn't just about Daniel. It was about Simon too. It was about a man who had spent decades building walls, perfecting the image of the tough judge, the untouchable critic, the man who couldn't be moved. And in 3 minutes those walls came down. Because some performances don't ask to be judged. They ask to be felt. And Simon Cowell, for all his sharpness, felt every second of it. The next season of America's Got Talent, Simon was different. Not softer, not weaker, but more present. He still gave harsh critiques. He still pressed the red X when performances fell short. But there was something new in the way he listened. A patience. A recognition that everyone on that stage was carrying something, and sometimes, what they carried was heavier than the performance itself. In interviews, Simon rarely spoke about that night. But when he did, he said something that captured everything. "I've spent my life judging people. But that night reminded me that some people don't need a judge. They need a witness. And I'm grateful I was there to be one." Daniel Crawford never auditioned again. He didn't need to. He had done what he came to do. He kept his promise. And in doing so, he gave the world a reminder that the most powerful performances aren't about perfection. They're about presence. About showing up. About honoring the people we love, even when they're gone. And Simon Cowell, the man who walked off stage, who refused to judge, who held a stranger while he cried, proved something the world didn't know he had in him, that beneath the armor, beneath the reputation, there was a man who understood that sometimes, being human is the bravest thing you can do. That jacket Daniel wore still hangs in his home. And every time he looks at it, he remembers the night he walked onto the biggest stage of his life, sang for his daughter, and found that he wasn't alone. Because Simon Cowell, the toughest man on television, stood with him. Not as a judge, but as a human being. 3 months after that night, Simon received a package. No return address. Inside was a photograph, Emily, young and smiling, holding a microphone at an open mic night. On the back, in Daniel's handwriting, "She would have loved knowing you heard her through me. Thank you for listening." Simon kept that photograph in his dressing room. Not on display. Tucked away in a drawer where only he would see it. But he looked at it before every show. A reminder that what happens on that stage isn't always about the performance. Sometimes it's about the person. The story. The pain they've carried just to get there. The crew noticed changes. Simon stayed later after tapings, talking to contestants who didn't make it through. Not giving false hope, but giving time. Presence. The thing he gave Daniel. He started asking different questions during auditions. Not just, "What are you performing?" but, "Why does this matter to you?" Because that night taught him something he'd forgotten in all the years of judging, critiquing, and building an empire. People don't walk onto that stage to be perfect. They walk on to be seen, to be heard, to prove to themselves and the world that they exist, that their story matters, that they're more than the pain they've survived. And Simon Cowell, the man who built a career on being untouchable, learned that the most powerful thing he could offer wasn't a golden buzzer or a record deal. It was witness. It was standing up when someone needed to know they weren't invisible. It was refusing to judge when judgment would have diminished something sacred. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. Because moments like these remind us why we tell stories in the first place: to connect, to heal, and to remember that we're all in this together.